What was the password? Sorry.
Oh, 6333. Oh, excuse me, it's 36. Let me try this. Okay, you're up and running?
Oops. No, not yet. Okay.
I'm Gary Striegler, and now I want to share some of the really practical things. Basically, this is where the rubber meets the road of the cuts and things you can actually do with a router. The first one I want to do is a really popular one I've used several times, and that's creating a faux panel. This has the look of a panel, but it's actually just cut with a router bit. I've used this detail on ends of cabinets, underneath windows, all kinds of stuff. It's really easy to do. Just going to give a short example of it. So I'm going to be using this router bit, which is a white side router bit that has a bearing above it. And I'm using this router that has the plunge function. Now, all I've done is just tacked some boards to this piece of pine to serve as a guide that the bearing that's above the bit is going to ride on these boards I've tacked around here. It is key. Now, I may not have taken, if I was going to do very much of this, I'd probably pocket screw this guide together, sand it down, make sure it was really smooth. Like that's pretty smooth there, pretty smooth there, pretty smooth there. So I think as long as I just start right here, this is a little rough, I think I'll be able to go through it. I'm not trying to be perfect in any of this. I'm just trying to kind of share some knowledge. And one thing that I always want to say when I start doing anything like this, I've been using a router for about 45 years. And you may be just picking a router up. So what I would tell you is, if you don't feel comfortable doing anything that you see me doing, there's always another way to do it. So I've got years and years of experience, and I've done lots of different things to the router. But again, most people, when they get hurt, say, you know, I felt a little bit uncomfortable right before I did that. So if you see me do anything and you feel uncomfortable doing it, just don't. Figure out another way to do it. But these are things that I've done. Again, I've got years of experience. I think with some practice, there's not anything that I do that someone else couldn't do. All right, here we go. So I actually demonstrated a couple things there that you don't want to do. Our frame was barely pinned on there because I wanted to be able to take it off and show you this. It probably should have been something pocket screwed together, but again, hopefully you see the context of how it works. Another thing that I've learned doing these is I could actually put a piece of wood out in the middle of this that the other edge of my router bit base would ride on. That would keep it from moving back and forth either direction. Now, I'm not even going to take time to totally clean that off, but you can see the cut we made. It's just like that. The bearing rides on this, and that guides the cut. So that's one great trick. Okay, here's another interesting thing. Now, this is a freeze detail I made for underneath the mantle. All these cuts were simply made with a router that had a bearing up above it, just like the one we just did. Basically, a bit like that. Now, all I did to make the round cut was we just drilled a hole in a board, and I think I've got to step out of the frame for just a second. So that's this. The other pieces that you see were actually just two boards that had blocks put in between them. And then I just bought a piece of quarter round trim and tacked it in the corner, and that's what gave me that radius. So I'm not going to try and reproduce this in my 7 or 8 minute video, but I'm going to at least show you how I can make this round cut, I hope. So I'm just going to use a headless pin to tack that in place so it doesn't go anywhere. Now this would also be a great, as a matter of fact, if you haven't done this very much, you probably would want to do this with a plunge router where you drop back in. I don't own very many plunge routers. You can get a plunge base even for a little router like this, but I should be able to just kind of ease my way into it. I hope I don't demonstrate one of those bloopers that, you know, makes it all over the internet. But I'm just going to try and show the concept. The bearing that's above the cutter right there just rides around that circle that I did. I'm going to shallow that up some. Even some more. That's getting in the neighborhood. All right. What I'll probably do is just kind of pivot it in like this. Now the trick is to stay still until the router bit stops. And by the way, that's a really good safety point, although a lot of times we don't do it. The safest thing you can do with a router is just leave it sitting on the work until the bit stops. So you can get the idea. Any kind of a pattern that you can make by putting blocks together, drilling holes, whatever, you can reproduce a pattern using a bit like this. Okay, this is one that took me a lot of years kind of figured out. You know, exterior doors have these 5/8 radius hinges, and every now and then we might have to cut one of those hinges, but all the hinges I'd ever cut had a 1/4 inch radius because I was using a 1/2 inch router bit. Well, I found, again, this is another white side bit. It's a great big bit, but it's 1 1/8 inch bit. Well, if you think about 1/2 1/8 inch, that's 5/8. What I've mocked up here is kind of like an exterior door jamb, and this bearing is just going to ride around there, and you'll see when I get through making this cut that I'll basically have the cut that would be for one of those 5/8 radius. Well, even the interior doors actually come with it now, but I first started doing them on exteriors. So anyway. One of the nice things about this big bit is it doesn't take very many passes around there to get that wood out of there. Let's see if I can tap this to come off. Yeah. So there it is. I mean, that's, of course, you would just adjust the size of the hinge just by the size of the notch that you made in your wood. But again, the bearing rides on the edge of the wood. I naturally get a 5/8 radius like those hinges have because I'm using an inch and an 1 1/8 bit. Routers are kind of starting to pile up here, okay? Another thing that we do a lot of times, door hardware, you know, you got striker plates, you've got those little ball catch plates. There's lots of different things that you need to just cut some small pattern cuts. And so I'm going to use, and I like to use this type of a router bit. This is just a 1/2 inch bit with a bearing above it. And so that's going to give you most of that type of hardware, like those latches and stuff, have a 1/4 inch radius. See, I've got some place here. Okay. This is actually a template for a T-strike, which you don't see anymore, but you get the idea. Again, the bearing is just going to ride this pattern. Standard D style strike, it's a whole lot easier to make. But there you can see I've got to do a little bit of work, but that's pretty much routed out a striker plate. All right. I want to backtrack. Well, actually, I'm not. One of the next things I want to show, I use a lot of pattern cutting to make details like this corbel. Of course, all different sizes of corbels. And to do that, all you have to start with is a pattern like this that you make. And this would actually make two corbel pieces. It's, you know, after I make the pattern, I'd cut it down the middle. So I've got a piece of pine here. And all I want to do is put my pattern, oh, by the way, so I traced it close, and then I jigsawed relatively close, so I'm not taking too much wood out. And now I'm going to just tack this on here with a couple of headless pins. Which, you know, about any kind of fashion would work. Do make sure that you had two headless pins or two brads in your gun when you do that. So I'm going to turn this over because I'm going to use this router bit that has a bearing on the bottom. The bearing is going to ride on this pattern below it, and it'll give me an exact duplicate. I like the 1/2 inch shank bits for this for sure, instead of the 1/4 inch, because you just don't get much rattling or anything like that. Okay. Now that bearing is going to clear. Sometimes if I'm doing a whole lot of this, I might even like set some blocks on my bench top that would hold this in place for me. But as you can see now, I've made you know, an exact duplicate. Now, so I cut this in the middle. Let me step over and cut it real quick. So I can start stacking these pieces to make a corbel. But in the piece that I showed, there was actually some layers that were a little bit thinner. Now this is probably one of my most fun tricks that I use a lot and I really enjoy. So how can I create this pattern that steps back a certain distance? Here's the way that I do it. This router bit is a 1/4 inch rebating bit, and it's actually part of a kit that you can get. This kit has multiple sizes bearings, so you can make a rebate or a rabbet anything from about a 1/4 inch up to about a 1/2 inch just by changing out the bearing. So there's two different ways that I can do it, but what I'm going to do so I could do more of these in the future is I'm going to tack, and by the way, these headless pins, I should have a pair of pliers here, but I don't. I want to tack this on to another piece of MDF if I can find one here. There it is right here. It's stuff going everywhere. So this is another one that's close to the same size. Now, I'm not going to put on a dust mask, but you know, when you're routing MDF, you should. It'd be really hard for me to talk in the video if I did. So first thing I want to do is I want to make, you know, an exact duplicate of this piece. So I'm going to go ahead and run the router around it. And I'll probably leave it tacked on there to do this. I'll go over and hold one. So now I want to swap over to this rebating bit. I'm going to run up the side. Okay, so now I've created a step back shoulder that's a 1/4 inch back. If I can get these two. Okay, so that's a 1/4 inch step back. Now what I want to do is take my other router bit and I'm going to set it shallow enough so that the bearing on it rides in that rebate that I just made, or that rabbit, if you want to call it that. Okay. So once I flush trim that out, I will have exactly moved that line back a 1/4 inch. I wish I could say I was smart enough to print this out, but I know I saw this in one that either Fine Woodworker or Fine Home Building. So now I have a pattern, when you look at it against that piece that I made, that is moved back exactly. So that is how I would make a piece that had this step back in it. And you can do varying. If I did that twice, I'd have a 1/2 inch step back. If I had a 3/8 rebate bit, did it twice, I'd have a 3/4. So I use that trick a lot. Okay. This is getting kind of long, but I do want to show you a couple more things. One is actually really straightforward if I can find a little scrap of wood. This is a beading bit, and there's lots of different sizes of beading bits, but it's a great way to add detail to something. For instance, I could take this little piece here that I made, and I could bead it. So, now I've got one beaded edge on it. But if I take a piece like this, and this can be a little bit tricky, but I'll make the first pass. So I've got one bead there now, and the problem with this is you can't wobble at all. Now I'm just going to try and do it real quick free-handed. So now I've created this really neat looking bead detail by coming from the front and from the edge. And again, there's lots of different sizes of these beading bits, so you can have lots of options there. So I'm about to run out of breath, and I'm about to run out of things to share, but I see at least one more that I want to share that's super practical. So today we're doing a lot of like barn style doors, and almost all those doors have a floor guide that requires putting a 1/4 inch slot in the bottom of the door. It's a pin that rides up and it keeps that door going straight. Now also a lot of thresholds that go on the bottom of exterior doors use a little door bottom that has 2 slots, and there's little fins that go up in those slots. So how do you cut that slot? So this is what I call a slot cutting bit. It's got a bearing, and this one may actually only be an 1/8 inch. You can get them, 1/4 inch, all different sort of sizes. But all that you have to do, imagine that this is a door. Is you just start at one end. And I would have, 1/4" slot cutter, I'd have a slot for that door guide. Of course, I need to adjust it down to be centered, but again, the bearing that's on the bottom of the bit rides on there. If I was doing one of those things like one of those thresholds that, it takes 2 little prongs to go in there, this won't be exactly accurate, but I just... So, there'd be your 2 prongs for your door bottom to go in there. So I just wanted to share at least some of the things. There's a ton more tricks and things that you can do with the router. It's one of the most useful tools that let you be creative that I know of. But these are just some of my favorites, and I hope that there'll be some that you can use too. Again, remember, be safe. If you don't feel comfortable doing it, figure out another way.
That's good. About 15 minutes. But I think if they're going to edit it,
They could edit out all the